The year 1619 holds a distinct significance in the annals of American history, marking the arrival of the first recorded Africans in the English colony of Virginia. These Africans, initially seized by Portuguese pirates from a Spanish ship, were later brought to Point Comfort, present-day Hampton, Virginia, aboard the English privateer ship White Lion. Their forced arrival foreshadowed centuries of enslavement and set the stage for the systemic racial inequalities that would come to define the trajectory of America. Though initially unclear whether these Africans were viewed as slaves or indentured servants, their presence signified the beginnings of a racialized labor system in English America. The Portuguese vessel from which the Africans were taken was en route to the Spanish colonies in the Americas. The ship had been transporting Africans primarily from the Kingdom of Ndongo in present-day Angola to serve as laborers in the New World. As the transatlantic slave trade expanded, Portuguese and Spanish ships played crucial roles in the transportation of African captives. The ship carrying these Africans was intercepted by English privateers, including the White Lion and another ship, the Treasurer, near the coast of what is now Mexico. They seized some of the captives and transported them to Virginia. The Africans who arrived in Virginia were not the first to set foot in the Americas. Africans had been brought to the Spanish and Portuguese colonies in the New World for nearly a century before their arrival in English America. However, the 1619 arrival is significant because it marked the introduction of African labor to English North America. Their landing at Point Comfort occurred when the colony of Virginia was still young, having been established only 12 years earlier in 1607. The colony, primarily an economic venture of the Virginia Company, was struggling to sustain itself, and labor shortages were a pressing issue. At the time, the legal and social status of these Africans was ambiguous. In Virginia, the system of indentured servitude had taken root, a form of contracted labor where European workers, mostly poor or imprisoned, agreed to work for a set number of years in exchange for passage to the New World. These workers were often promised land or freedom upon completion of their service. When the first Africans arrived, some historians argue they were treated similarly to white indentured servants. Records indicate that some of these Africans were able to gain their freedom after a certain period of service. For example, Anthony Johnson, one of the earliest known Africans in Virginia, was able to acquire land and became a property owner, raising the possibility that early Africans in Virginia could transcend servitude. Over time, however, the status of Africans in Virginia began to change. The Virginia colony's tobacco economy was growing rapidly, and the need for labor became more insatiable. The limited supply of white indentured servants, who were prone to high mortality rates and later conflicts over land, made the colony's leaders seek a more permanent and controllable labor force. Africans, viewed as outsiders with no rights or claims to the land, increasingly became the preferred solution to the colony's labor needs. This shift was gradual but definitive, moving from an early period of fluid social status for Africans to a rigid, racially defined system of chattel slavery. A series of legal decisions and enactments codified this racial hierarchy. In 1640, a legal case involving an African named John Punch highlighted this transformation. Punch, along with two white indentured servants, attempted to escape from their servitude. When they were caught, the two white men were sentenced to additional years of indenture, while Punch, because he was African, was sentenced to a lifetime of servitude. This case is one of the earliest known legal distinctions made on the basis of race in Virginia, and indicates the beginnings of a system that viewed Africans not as indentured laborers, but as lifelong slaves. The formal codification of slavery in Virginia came in 1661, when a law was passed explicitly recognizing slavery as a legal institution. This law stated that all non-Christian servants brought to the colony would be held as slaves. Over the following decades, additional laws were passed that further entrenched the system of race-based slavery, including laws that made slavery hereditary, meaning children born to enslaved women would also be enslaved, regardless of the father's status. This system ensured that African laborers and their descendants would remain perpetual property bound to serve the economic interests of white landowners. The transformation of Virginia's labor system from one based on indentured servitude to one based on chattel slavery was shaped not only by economic necessity, but also by broader social and cultural factors. English colonists viewed Africans as racially inferior, a perception influenced by long-standing European attitudes toward Africa and its peoples. These views were reinforced by the growing presence of African laborers in the colony, which created a sense of racial difference that colonists used to justify the subjugation and exploitation of Africans. As the institution of slavery became more entrenched, racial divisions hardened, and the ideology of white superiority became a central tenet of colonial society. The shift to a system of slavery had far-reaching consequences for Virginia and the future United States. Economically, slavery provided the labor force necessary to sustain the tobacco plantations that became the backbone of the colonial economy. These plantations generated enormous wealth for a small class of white landowners, while the enslaved Africans who worked them were subjected to brutal conditions and denied the most basic human rights. Slavery also had profound social and political implications, reinforcing a rigid class system that placed wealthy white landowners at the top and enslaved Africans at the bottom. The arrival of the first Africans in Virginia also had lasting cultural and demographic impacts. Over time, the African population in Virginia grew, primarily through the continued importation of enslaved Africans. These Africans brought with them a rich cultural heritage, including languages, religious practices, and agricultural knowledge, which influenced the development of colonial Virginia. The blending of African, European, and indigenous cultures in the colony created a unique, though deeply unequal, social landscape. The consequences of the 1619 arrival of Africans in Virginia reverberated across American history. The system of racial slavery that took root in the colony spread to other English colonies, and by the late 17th century, slavery was entrenched throughout the American South. This system of slavery laid the foundation for the economic and social structures that would persist in the United States for centuries, long after slavery was abolished. The racial divisions and inequalities that slavery created continued to shape American society, contributing to the systemic racism that persists to this day. The 1619 arrival also occupies a significant place in historical memory. For many, it marks the beginning of African American history, a history characterized by struggle, resilience, and the enduring fight for freedom and equality. The story of these first Africans is a reminder of the deep and painful legacy of slavery in the United States, as well as the contributions of African Americans to the nation's history and culture. The arrival of the first recorded Africans in Virginia in 1619 was a pivotal event that set in motion a chain of developments that would shape the future of the United States. These Africans were the forerunners of millions who would be forcibly brought to the Americas and subjected to the horrors of slavery. The institution of slavery that developed in Virginia and spread throughout the colonies had profound economic, social, and political consequences, and its legacy continues to influence American society. The events of 1619 serve as a crucial chapter in the history of the United States, underscoring the deep connections between race, labor, and power that have defined the nation's development.